Trafalgar Law, let me give you a hand. Seriously, the guy is definitely going to need a hand because Doflamingo kind of, spoiler alert, cuts his arm off in this week's episode. There was a lot of action this week, my friends. So much action you could pour it over pancakes. So thick and rich and badass. This week's episode of One Piece was very simple but very enjoyable, so let me just talk about some of my favorite moments from this week's episode. First and foremost, Zoro versus Pika. Little by little, we're getting to see more of this battle. In this week's episode, it's still just more of the same, but I still love the fact that Pika can basically transfer his body and his essence to all of these different bodies of stone, whether it be the castle or the actual giant cliffside. Especially the look of his face, which is coming out from the side of the mountain, is really creepy. But then you end up laughing your ass off and pissing your pants when you hear his voice. Also, is it just my imagination, or did Orlumbus play bowling with some of Doflamingo's goons this week? I'm not even kidding. There's this scene where he's trying to help out Zoro while he's fighting Pika because all of Doflamingo's goons are getting ready to shoot him, which I really don't think was going to be a problem for Zoro anyway, but hell, who cares? We get to see Orlumbus literally tell all of these soldiers to line up while he picks up one of them, turns them into a ball, and then tosses it right at the group, and then they all get knocked up in the air. They're all stiff and flying around like pins, and the only thing that was missing was some cheap bowling sound effects. But honestly, it was a pretty funny scene, and it's just the type of ridiculous stuff that One Piece can get away with. But there are two major battles from this week's episode. First, of course, we have Doflamingo versus Law, which is slowly but surely evolving into a battle from Dragon Ball Z, but that's only because of their abilities. Because Law is able to sort of use his room abilities to transport himself, and the fact that Doflamingo can balance himself on strings, they're literally just flying around in the air, and it's all really crazy and everything. But this is all just a real big lead up to the scene where Doflamingo cuts off Law's arm, and the build up to it is just ridiculous. The actual way that Doflamingo cuts off Trafalgar Law's arm is pretty freaking awesome too. I love it because they're up in the air, he's holding his arms, and then he pulls up his leg, which has this massive razor string behind it, which he uses to put right down on top of his arm, and as opposed to just cutting it in mid-air, they start spinning as they're flying down towards the ground, and then boom! They just make this big explosion, and the next thing you know, Law's arm is gone, he's bleeding out and completely freaking out over the situation. It's a pretty ghastly scene. Before Doflamingo can finish off Law, Luffy decides to interrupt the battle as he's still battling against Bellamy and the clone of Doflamingo, and he completely destroys it in this week's episode when he hits it point blank with a Red Hawk and then goes at it with a Jet Gatling, which explodes it up into the air crocodile style, and this interrupts the battle between Law and Doflamingo, and it all ends with Luffy just getting pissed and screaming into the air, "To be continued" screen, and there we are. So what's the rundown on this week's episode of One Piece? This was just a big action episode, as simple as that. Just a lot of crazy choreography, lots of flying around, and lots of impact. My only negative about this week's episode is that at times, the animation and the artwork didn't look all that great. There were times that it was a little stiff, and it just didn't really have a lot of movement behind it. But there were still some really great artwork cues, and there were still some really great scenes overall. I think Trafalgar Law's arm getting cut off is one of the biggest things that we've seen from this entire arc. Of course, Law could probably just reattach his arm. He does have the Op-Op fruit. But you're not just going to react normally after having your arm cut off, especially the way Doflamingo did it. That had to be beyond painful, and he barely contain his anger and his freaking pain as he's sitting there writhing on the ground. Like I said, it's a very graphic and grisly image, and one of the more violent scenes that I've actually seen from One Piece, especially because you get to see it all right there. His arm's right next to him. There's blood that's coming out. It's pretty freaking messed up. I'm glad they didn't censor it too much. And then, of course, there's the scene with Luffy, which I honestly thought was probably my favorite part of the episode, especially when he got to hit the clone of Doflamingo with the Red Hawk and then started using the Jet Gatling. That definitely reminded me of when he was actually fighting against Crocodile and Alabasta, where he actually used the forces of his punches to destroy the ground that was above him. That was pretty freaking awesome, especially the way the clone looked as it was being destroyed, turning all white and then cut up into multiple pieces. But pretty much that's all I have to say about this week's episode. Just some really cool action all around, some pretty big developments with Law losing his arm and Luffy getting all pissed off right at the end, with a promise of even more action to come with that classic to be continued screen. It didn't have the perfect animation and artwork, but I still think it was a really entertaining episode of One Piece, so I'm going to give this week's episode a 4 out of 5. Check it out, One Piece fans. If you've been following the anime or you're reading the manga version, check out this week's episode. You might see something you like. Thank you guys for watching my review. Make sure to like it and share it with your friends. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way you can see all of our latest anime and manga reviews. You guys can also check out our weekly podcast show, The Powerful Nerdcast. You can watch that show on our YouTube channel, and you can download it for free at iTunes and at RogueIntel.com. I'll put links for all that stuff in the description box below. Thank you guys again for watching, and as always, stay dandy, baby.